Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering a build that can obliterate an entire encounter in a single swing. This build runs into the fray and shuts down enemies, whether in singly or in groups, with incredible damage output, self-healing with every strike, and damage resistances, making it almost impossible to kill. I think this is one of the most on-flavor possible builds for Minsc, because it's a melee ranger that uses a great sword, a two-handed weapon, just like Minsc, and gets in close and personal to kick butt in melee and take your boot to evil, while also being one of the best possible builds for new players, in my opinion, because it's very resilient, very hard, and very straightforward to play, while also giving you a lot of cool options and things that can give you insight into how more complicated characters will play, so it's a great tool for learning the game if you're relatively new or want to introduce someone to the game. I'm talking about the Melee Ranger, and specifically the Melee Hunter Ranger, whose late-game Whirlwind attack lets you just absolutely flatten groups of enemies, while having excellent damage output, mobility, and utility throughout the early game. You also get to stay mono-classed, and use that class in a way that's pretty unusual for honor mode builds, or for Baldur's Gate 3 builds in general, so you get to feel smarter than everyone else for doing things in an unusual way, and still having it be very effective. Without further ado, let's get to the build. We're using Minsc as the example character here because this is a ranger build, and he's the ranger of the group, and also I think this build is incredibly on flavor for him because it is a build that fits his exact character and history. But if you're building this as a custom character, then it doesn't really matter what race you pick for this build because you get all of your weapon and armor proficiencies from the build itself, so you don't need to pick a race in order to pick those up. You can get some small edges by making certain choices. Wood Elf or Half Wood Elf's bonus movement speed are very good for this build, even better than for normal melee builds, which is already very good, because this build has somewhat finicky positioning sometimes, and the extra 5 feet of movement speed can help you hit one more enemy in your whirlwind attacks. Dwergar's out of combat invisibility can also help you with positioning, and the enlarge from Dwergar is very good for this build. Or Half Orc, because this build will be making a lot of melee attacks and will often be using a two-handed weapon which have high damage dice, so rolling an extra one on a critical hit with Half Orc can be very strong. You're going to be making a lot of attacks, so you'll get a decent number of criticals, even if you don't build your items specifically for critical hit chance. You will still get a decent amount of value out of Half Orc, and the Relentless Endurance can help keep you alive in some circumstances, because this build is very resilient, so even the ability to come back at 1 hit point can be pretty useful in some circumstances. Since this is a mono-class build, we will of course be starting with Ranger, and for our ability scores, we are going to take a very natural ability spread of 16 strength, because we're going to be using strength-based weapons, two-handed weapons, 16 constitution to keep ourselves alive, because we just want to have the highest possible hit points. This build will get a lot of damage resistances and healing, so high base hit points are really good for us, and 14 dexterity for armor class and initiative. Even though we will be able to wear heavy armor, there will be points in the game where you will be better off in medium armor with 14 dexterity, so you can have higher AC with some medium armors and some heavy, then whatever heavy armor you have access to, depending on exactly what order you pick up items in. And initiative is of course very important, so we want high dexterity to make sure that we have that. And then 12 wisdom. We don't actually need this for our ranger spells. We won't be taking any ranger spells that require us to have high wisdom, but it's good for your wisdom saving throws, which are very important. For our skill selection here, the only really important ones to make sure that we have are athletics and perception. Every character that can take perception should, because it's required for your party. Just being able to see traps ahead of time is so valuable and will save you a lot of damage, and athletics is very important for every strength-based character, because the ability to reposition enemies is very powerful in and of itself, but especially so for this character who wants enemies to be grouped up next to each other, so being able to push them so that they land adjacent to each other and then walk up and hit both of them at once is very, very good. For our remaining skill point, it doesn't particularly matter what we take. I like having stealth just because it can be pretty useful. Even with only 14 dexterity, there are some times where you might want to make a stealth check to try to get into a good position, or sneak away from a fight. And mostly just these other abilities are not going to be terribly useful for you. If you have a background with Sleight of Hand, this can be your lockpicking character. It will be fine at it, but we're not investing in dexterity, so the mainly important ones are athletics and perception. For our favored enemy, we're going to select Ranger Knight, because this gives us access to heavy armor proficiency, and this character is going to be up close and personal. It's strength-based. We want to be wearing heavy armor most of the time, and also none of these other favored enemy abilities are particularly strong. And then for our Natural Explorer upgrade, we're going to take Wasteland Wanderer for fire, because fire resistance is incredibly useful, especially in the early game. There are a lot of things that do fire damage, including your own party, probably by throwing Alchemist's Fire or having NPCs drop fireballs on your head. And being resistant to fire damage makes you much, much more survivable in the early game. As we progress, we're going to become resistant to several of the most common damage types in the game, making ourselves extremely difficult to kill thanks to our high constitution and high base hit points, and of course the healing that we'll get from attacking. That's it for level 1, so let's move on to level 2. And at Ranger level 2, we get access to our first spells and our fighting style. For our fighting style, we're going to select Defense. Unfortunately, Ranger doesn't get access to Great Weapon fighting style, which we would take if it was available. You can take a single level of Fighter in this build in order to get that, and that's not a bad choice at all by any means. But Defense fighting style is also very good and makes this character even more resilient. Our high armor class, high hit points, and high damage resistance combined with our inherent healing that we will get from items and from defensive effects from our allies potentially make this character an incredible tank, and defense plays into that. And then for our spell selection, we're going to take Hunter's Mark. In the early game, we won't have there will be many turns where we don't have a use for our bonus action. Hunter's Mark just increases our damage against a high value target and is very good for just increasing our damage, while we hit harder than an Archer Ranger build will, especially at the early stages of the game. Hunter's Mark is still just very good value for reducing enemy, for taking down a high priority target like a boss, and then you can swap it to new creatures. So Hunter's Mark will just increase our damage significantly in the early game. And then we're going to pick up Long Strider because bonus mobility is so important to this character and to your entire party. The secret with Long Strider is it's a ritual spell, so while it doesn't say this in the tooltip, you can cast it without spending a spell slot. So you can just give this to your whole party, increase your whole party's movement speed by 10 feet for the entire day, and that's an enormous amount of value over the course of an adventuring day, especially for this build that wants to close the distance. At character level 3, we get to select our subclass, and of course the subclass that we're going to select is Hunter Ranger. Now, Hunter Ranger does come online a little bit later, or rather gets its most powerful ability later on in the build. So you could, if you want to do some respecking as you play through the game, of course you can respec your character at any time, take Gloomstalker Ranger and then respec into Hunter Ranger later on. But for the purposes of this build guide, we're going to go with Hunter all the way through. For our spell selection at this level, we're going to take Enhance Leap, because Enhanced Leap is just more mobility. We have high strength, so we're very good at jumping. This is another ritual spell, so you can cast it without spending a spell slot, leaving all of your spell slots clear to cast more Hunter's Marks. And you can pre-cast this on yourself or your team before combat in order to gain a tremendous amount of mobility with triple jump distance. You can jump as a bonus action in Baldur's Gate 3, so this effectively increases your movement speed significantly. Combined with Long Strider, it means you can traverse the entire battlefield very, very easily. Because we picked Hunter, we also get access to Hunter's Prey, and honestly, any of these three abilities can work quite well for this build. And which you pick, I think, is going to depend a little bit on how experienced you are with the game. If you're relatively new to the game, I recommend taking Colossus Slayer. This is very easy, requires no input from you to work. You just deal additional damage if the target's below its hit point maximum. That can either be in later turns of combat, it can be in with your second attack in a round of combat, you just get this extra d8 of damage, or it can be if an ally has previously damaged the enemy. There are lots of ways to deal one guaranteed damage with, say, a grenade or something like that. You can guarantee reducing an enemy below hit points, and they only need to be 1 hit point below their maximum to trigger Colossus Slayer, so it's fairly easy to guarantee that this goes off and get you an extra d8 of damage. Giant Killer is fun to use, but less powerful overall. There are lots of fights where there are no large or bigger creatures in the fight, so there are lots of fights where this won't come up. And Hordebreaker is actually extremely strong if you're very experienced with the game and very confident about your unit positioning. You can use athletics or other ways for shoving, or other ways to reposition enemies in order to move two enemies close enough to each other to trigger Hordebreaker, and then you get a whole extra attack, which is going to be way more damage than the 1d8 damage from Colossus Slayer. It's obviously much more situational than Colossus Slayer, but it's a higher peak than the 1d8 damage, because you are probably doing closer. 1d8 damage is an extra 4.5 damage on average. A Hordebreaker attack is probably closer to 20, 30, or in the late game, like 50 damage that you're adding to your attacks. So you get a much higher peak, even though it goes off less often. And if you are confident that you will be able to arrange the battlefield so that you can trigger Hordebreaker reliably, then I recommend taking Hordebreaker. But again, if you're relatively new to the game, take Colossus Slayer. For the purpose of this build, because this is a simple class guide, we're going to take Colossus Slayer, but I wanted to mention both of those as good options. We don't need to replace a spell because we have the perfect spell selection already, so let's move on to level 4. At level 4, we get access to our very first feat, and while on an Archer Ranger, I would almost always recommend taking Sharpshooter, so you might expect that I would recommend taking Great Weapon Master here. I'm actually going to defer taking Great Weapon Master until level 8 on this build. The reason for this is that Archer Ranger gets access to the archery fighting style, so you get +2 to hit, but Great Weapon Master doesn't, and it's not as easy to trigger advantage on your melee attacks as it is on your ranged attacks. If you have lots of ways to improve your chance to hit, then Great Weapon Master can still be very good to take early. So if you have Bless on an ally, lots of ways to trigger advantage, maybe you have an ally who's a Wolf Totem Barbarian or something like that, you can still take Great Weapon Master, but most of the time we're just going to want to boost our strength so that we can increase our damage and chance to hit more reliably. Either of those can be good, and again, this will depend a little bit on how experienced you are with the game and the makeup of your team, but for most players, I think it's going to be easier if you take +2 strength here and save Great Weapon Master until you have more increases to your hit chance that you'll start getting later on in the game, and can boost your chance to hit with Great Weapon Master attacks to more reliable levels. At Ranger level 5, we get extra attack, meaning we can now make 2 attacks in a single round, and so we are, or in a single action, so we have effectively doubled our damage output. And we also get access to second level spells, which is a really significant boost for Rangers, because there's one spell in particular here that just wins a lot of fights entirely on its own, does not require you to have high save DCs or anything like that, and that we as a character with high constitution are pretty good at maintaining concentration on. That's Spike Growth. Spike Growth makes you gives enemies half movement speed, and they take constant damage. And so if you place it under melee enemies, they just get completely ruined, especially if you combine it with anything that blinds them so they can't jump out of it, because if they're blinded, they won't be able to target an area on the ground outside of their vision range, which will be very short. So they won't be able to jump out of it, and will have to walk through the Spike Growth to get to you. So you can combine this with Fog Cloud from a party member, or Hunger of Hadar from a warlock, to just completely ruin entire encounters on its own. But even without those spells, Spike Growth just shuts down encounters completely, and is very powerful, even getting it a little bit later on. We don't need to replace any spells here because we still want all 3 of our level 1 spells. They're still just very good for us, but Spike Growth will just let us win encounters, and of course doubling our damage output with extra attack is excellent. At Ranger level 6, we get access to another favored enemy and another natural explorer ability. For our favored enemy here, we're going to go with Keeper of the Veil, because protection from evil and good is the most relevant of these spells, but honestly you can pick any of these based on flavor, or if there's a skill that you feel like you want to have proficiency in. These, other than Ranger Knight, for this build do not provide significant bonuses, so you can pick whichever one you think is most flavorful for your character and how it's developed, but Keeper of the Veil's protection from evil and good can give you some immunity to Frightened, which is a pretty dangerous condition from certain kinds of enemies, and will be pretty good against that kind of enemy. There are some circumstances where it comes up, so this is the most relevant spell. Not a hugely important decision, though. For Natural Explorer, we're going to take Wasteland Wanderer for Cold. It's the second most common form of damage. Fire is the most common by far, and cold is a little more common than poison, so we're going to pick up cold resistance. Now we're resistant to even more elemental damage types and are very, very hard to kill because of our high hit points, high armor class, because we're in heavy armor, and resistances, so this character is very good at staying alive. At character level 7, we get our next Hunter Ranger ability, Defensive Tactics, and we get to choose between Escape the Horde, Steel Will, or Multi-Attack Defense. Escape the Horde can let us move around a little bit more easily in combat, giving enemies disadvantage on opportunity attacks against us, so we can walk away from enemies. But honestly, once we're in melee with an enemy, we just want to hit them usually, so I'm not too worried about this. And enemies will have a hard time hitting us or damaging us in a relevant way regardless, so we don't particularly need Escape the Horde in general. Steel Will gives us advantage on saving throws against fear, which is a dangerous effect, but we can become immune to fear fairly easily with appropriate spellcasting or with items. We also have protection from good and evil, giving us immunity to fear against a lot of the types of enemies that cause fear. So the one that we're going to select is Multi-Attack Defense. This is a passive, so you don't have to do anything to have it work, and any enemy that attacks you multiple times in a turn suffers a -4 penalty to subsequent attacks. That's going to prevent a lot of damage, especially because this character will be up in the faces of a lot of enemies who will be forced to attack it. Often you will position your party so this is their only viable target, and then if they make multiple attacks against your Ranger or against Minsc, they're going to miss a lot of them because you'll have high armor class and multi-attack defense, so this can prevent a lot of damage to your party. For our spell selection here, we're going to take Silence. Silence is another ritual, so it doesn't require a spell slot if you cast it before combat starts, and there are a lot of enemies that this can just completely shut down. While it does take your concentration, it's a great way to just win some encounters outright, because if you can keep a spellcasting character or a character that needs to make noise for one of its powerful abilities or legendary actions inside of the silence, then they can't do anything, so silence will just completely win that encounter immediately. At Ranger level 8, we get access to our second feat, and we're going to take Great Weapon Master if we haven't already. Great Weapon Master gives us the ability to make additional attacks when we kill a target or get a critical hit as a bonus action, so it gives us a lot of extra damage, and of course it lets us make reduce our chance to hit to increase our damage. This is usually a good trade, and will be especially a good trade when we're making Whirlwind attacks in the late game, because it's going to apply the +10 damage to every enemy that we hit. So not only does this give us more attacks, it also makes our attacks much stronger. All we have to do is find ways to land these hits reliably, but by this point in the game, you should have lots of increases to your hit chance, so you should be able to do that for sure. At Ranger level 9, we get access to 3rd level spells, and we get to take Plant Growth. Plant Growth quarters enemy movement speed, so it's even more debilitating for moving around than spike growth, and it doesn't take concentration, so you can layer it on top of having spike growth or hunter's mark running, and it just completely shuts down melee enemies. We're also immune to our own spike growth and plant growth now, because at level 8 we got Land's Stride, which I didn't mention, but makes you immune to the effects of difficult terrain, so you can now pass over your own plant growth and spike growth with complete impunity, using it to shut down enemies. Walking up to an enemy, laying down plant growth under you and them, means that you can move and they can't, which is a bad position for them to be in against a powerful melee fighter. At Ranger level 10, we get to take another favored enemy, and we're of course going to take Mage Breaker so we can have the most important spell in the game, True Strike, just to annoy people in the YouTube comments. And then for our Natural Explorer, I've mentioned already what we're going to pick up, Wasteland Wanderer for poison, giving us resistance to 3 different elemental damage types permanently, and we can add even more resistances if we want to through itemization or through other spell casting to make this character take half damage from just about every enemy in the game. Then at Ranger level 11, this is what we're here for. This is the thing that Hunter Ranger is for. We get access to Volley, which works with ranged attack, so it's not for us, but also Whirlwind attack. You spin in a circle and just hit every enemy that you can reach for enormous amounts of damage, because we're swinging a gigantic two-handed greatsword around in a circle, so we're going to be doing massive damage with every one of these attacks. Whirlwind attack is cool because it just uses your attack. It's not an action in and of itself. So because we have extra attack, we can make multiple whirlwind attacks in a turn and use that to take down enemies. And we have Great Weapon Master, so we can make attacks as a bonus action. So when we get a critical hit, which we're very likely to, we'll get another attack. Now, the Great Weapon Master attack can't itself be a whirlwind attack, but it will just give you a ton of extra attacks overall. Because you are almost always going to kill an enemy or get a critical hit for your Great Weapon Master attack. This is the ability that lets you just wipe out whole encounters, and from this point on, the game is going to be about trying to group up enemies so that you can hit as many of them as possible with a whirlwind attack, which is both incredibly effective and a fun tactical puzzle that I personally really enjoy, and I hope you do as well. For our spell selection here, we're going to take Protection from Energy, because this can give us access to any of the damage types that we don't already have damage resistance to. We can gain damage resistance for encounters where we need them, and also because there's not really anything else here that we particularly need. If you feel like you don't want Protection from Energy, maybe you have it on another party member, maybe you're certain that you won't need to gain resistance to other damage types, you can take Fog Cloud, because you can just blind an enemy with no saving throw, and that's always very powerful. Or Lesser Restoration as a decent panic button if one of your allies gets paralyzed. Overall, though, the main thing that we're going for here is to pick up Whirlwind Attack, because it just completely wipes out whole encounters on its own. And finally, at Ranger level 12, we get access to our very last feat, and we're just going to increase our strength to 20 to make sure that we can hit as many enemies as possible, as hard as we possibly can. Any other boosts to strength that we get are still very good for this character, and while many strength characters in Baldur's Gate wouldn't mind using a strength elixir instead of putting actual points in strength, this character is very incentivized to use bloodlust elixirs, so we really do want to increase our strength as high as possible. Alright, my friends, that is the Hunter Ranger build, but let's talk about items, because they will let us take this build to the next level. For items for this character, there's really 2 types of things that you are looking for. Firstly, this character has one main weakness, and that is that it has 14 dexterity, meaning that it's got relatively low initiative. Especially on honor mode, going first can be incredibly important. So the very first thing that we're looking for is ways to boost our initiative. Any item that can increase our initiative rolls, even small amounts, can be hugely helpful to this character. So we're just looking for anything that gives us a plus to our initiative boost, to our initiative bonus. Next, of course, we're looking for a very powerful two-handed weapon. In the early game, that's just going to be whichever one you have that does the most damage. But in the late game, you're looking where after you get Whirlwind attack, you're looking for weapons with cool on-hit effects, because you're going to apply the on-hit effect to every enemy that you hit. So a weapon that does something cool when it hits an enemy is very good. In the late game, the one that I like the most for that reason is the Sword of Chaos, which heals you every time you hit an enemy. You can heal for 50 hit points per turn with this if you can group up enough enemies. So this gives you a lot of additional sustainability, as well as just being a pretty powerful weapon overall. You will likely want you also want gloves that increase your damage output, or any items that increase your damage output, like the Dark Justiciar gauntlets, which will just increase the amount of damage you're doing. Remember, every attack you're doing is hitting multiple enemies, so all of these effects get multiplied. Although I will say this build also benefits very strongly from the Gloves of Dexterity, because you want to increase your initiative and your chance to hit. Anything that increases your attack is also pretty good for this character. So if nobody else in your party needs these, this is a good candidate to wear them. You're going to want an item like the Amulet of Misty Step that gives you Misty Step because you don't naturally have access to it, and items that increase your movement speed like the Haste Helm, which gives you momentum, increasing your movement speed at the start of combat, are very good because just getting into position is super important for this character. Finally, you're going to want the highest armor class piece of heavy armor that you can find, ideally with damage reduction added to it, so something like the Reaper's Embrace that reduces incoming damage. Whenever you take fire damage or any of the damage types that you're resistant to, that damage gets halved, and then the flat damage reduction is applied, so even these small amounts of damage reduction add up a lot when you're resistant to a lot of damage types. This character also is heavily incentivized to use a Bloodlust Elixir, because the additional attack that you can use can be more Whirlwind attacks, and you're going to kill something basically every turn of combat, since you do so much damage to so many enemies at once. Though, of course, like every strength build, you can always use an Elixir of Hill or Cloud Giant Strength to increase your strength. Finally, because we're hitting as many enemies as possible with single swings, you want to be using weapon coatings aggressively, something like a crawler mucus, because again, you're going to apply this in an area of effect, so you can take out whole groups of enemies with weapon effects. Special shout out also to one more item that I really like for this build, the Martial Exertion Gloves. This is an item that I see kind of underrated, but basically it lets you take a bunch of damage to gain an additional attack per turn and double your movement speed. Double movement speed is huge for this build because positioning is very important, and you don't care about taking damage because you're going to heal it all up by swinging the Sword of Chaos around and just heal that back up. So an extra attack and additional movement speed from the Martial Exertion Gloves are very powerful. So basically, first priority is initiative, second priority is a great two-handed weapon, third priority is high armor class, but then there's also some other specific items that you should keep an eye out for. Finally, just a quick word on how Whirlwind Attack itself actually works. So when you select Whirlwind Attack, you are going to get this preview, and this just uses your attack, so you can make the attack multiple times per turn, and also as many as you have attacks, and also it will not hit allies, so you can safely position yourself next to allies and use it in large groups of enemies without your allies taking any damage. Whirlwind Attack has a 7-foot radius, so you do need to get used to which patterns of enemies you will be able to actually target, because you need to know whether you're going to be able to hit them before you move into the area if you want to maximize your movement. So this pattern of enemies, for example, we could hit with a Whirlwind Attack with appropriate positioning. We would be able to get all of them inside of the radius, as you can see here. But if we couldn't, we could also force that to happen by pushing the enemy into the radius and making sure that we have the angle correct. We would be able to guarantee that we would hit all of the enemies with a Whirlwind Attack by moving them together and making sure that we can then hit every enemy in the area. So that way you can use a bonus action to reposition an enemy next to another enemy, forcing them to be hit by the Whirlwind attack. And of course, if your allies have ways to reposition enemies, like a Berserker Barbarian can throw them, or a Spellcaster can cast Gust of Wind to push them around, or Telekinesis, you can group them all up more easily. Finally, I should of course mention the best way to group enemies for Whirlwind attack, and one of the most powerful possible tools for this build, though this will involve a story spoiler, so if you want to stop the video here, I will not blame you if you're not looking for story spoilers at all. But the most powerful way to pull enemies into the center for Whirlwind attack is of course the Illithid power, Black Hole. Black Hole has a massive radius and can be cast multiple times in an encounter to continuously group up enemies, so you can either get it on this character as a bonus action or on any ally, and use it to pull enemies together in order to do the most possible to hit the most possible enemies in a single attack. As you can see, Black Hole has a huge radius and pulls enemies towards the center, so you can group an entire encounter much more easily with this ability, and then hit them all with a Whirlwind attack. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at the most devastating whirling attacker in Baldur's Gate 3, and a really fun way to play Hunter Ranger. The tactical puzzle of Whirlwind attack, I think, is very interesting to set up, and honestly, this is much more fun to me than the volley version, which doesn't have to care about its positioning at all. Whirlwind attack is much more satisfying to use because it requires you as the player to be a little bit clever with how you use it. As always, of course, if you've enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a comment and like the video. Both of those things help me out a ton with the algorithm, so I do appreciate you taking the time to do so. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 builds and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.